there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a chat about my mid-year reading statistics. I realized right around the end of June I had hit the 100 mark on Goodreads, and I thought that will make doing the statistics really easy. So the first thing that I looked at was the style of writing of the individual books. So of the books that I read in the first half of the year, 20% were comics, 11% were essay collections, 2% were short story collections, 8% were poetry collections, and 56% were long-form prose. And within the long-form prose, it was a 34-22 split of fiction to nonfiction. So I thought that was interesting because I had been saying at the end of last year that I wanted to, I think my percentage of poetry had been sitting between basically 2 and 3% for the past several years. So 8% for the first half of the year is not bad. I was mildly surprised that I didn't have any mixed type items. I do think I actually misclassified one thing as pure poetry when it was actually a poetry art combination. I am slightly surprised that comics are only 20% because I feel like usually that's around a full quarter for me, but still pretty close to in line with the standards. In terms of fiction versus nonfiction, came out to 53% fiction, 38% nonfiction, and 9% complicated, which I think is primarily poetry because a lot of that, how do you classify that? And some of that I think would have been essay collections in which there might have been some mixed fiction, nonfiction leaf blower. As for where the books came from, 91% were library books, 8% were books that I owned, 1% was a book that I borrowed, and specifically that I borrowed from my mother. And I believe it was a mystery during March Mystery Madness. And I think I actually expected to borrow more books from her, but yeah. That, I think, is very similar to what happened last year, as I believe. In terms of demographic type stuff, let's see. 52% of the books that I read were by female authors, 42% by male authors, 5% were either collections or were comics that had both male and female authors working on the same project, and 1% was a two-spirit, which was one book. Since this is out of 100, it was a two-spirit author. In terms of languages in which the books were first published, 82% of the books that I read were originally published in English, 4% were in French, 4% in Japanese, 4% in Turkish, 3% in Spanish, 2% in Arabic, 1% Farsi, and 1% Russian. This was something that I didn't track last year, and when I was making one of these videos, I said to myself that I probably should have taken a look at that, because I'm saying track, but this isn't something I do on an ongoing basis. I just go and look at the year in review on Goodreads and make little tick boxes after the fact, because I find this interesting to look at kind of in retrospect, but I try not to guide my reading in terms of demographics, because I think that gets to be a little tokenizing if you pay too much attention to that. So I'll have to think about what that means and what I want to do with it. While we're on the topic of language, 95% of the books that I read in English, and 5% were in French, all of which were comics format. I do have a couple of novels that I'm currently reading because that was something I had mentioned last year that I wanted to see if I could mix that up a bit. So I haven't, so I didn't in the first half of the year, but I'm sort of working on that now. Sudden wind, I'm sure that's going to get picked up on the microphone. In terms of ethnic backgrounds, the numbers were roughly a third each of white or European heritage and Asian heritage. Around 17% were people who would be black identifying, 6% First Nation, 8% it's complicated, which I always say is people who would identify one way but would be identified differently in an American context, which tends to be the context in which we talk about this on BookTube, which normally is North African, Middle Eastern, and Latin American. In this case, it was 100% of my It's Complicated category is Middle Eastern or West Asian this time. And then the remainder was books with multiple authors, multiple backgrounds. I find categories like this to not be necessarily useful once you get beyond a certain split, just because there's so many subcategories. I had mentioned, I think last year, that I didn't read a huge amount of East European or Southeast Asian work, and I think this year, if I broke it down, there were 2 East European and 4 Southeast Asian authored books that I read. The other one was, I think last year, all of the First Nations authors that I read were Canadian, and I think this year one of them was American. So, you know, that's mixing it up a bit. Now we have a siren. Maybe I should stop doing these outside. Alright, so in terms of genre for fiction, of the fiction that I read, 27%, there's the dog shaking his collar, and another industrial truck is driving by. Great. Alright, genre. So, of the fiction that I read, 27% was literary fiction, 21% was science fiction or fantasy, 25% was mystery and crime, so pretty close to equal quarters for that. And of the remaining quarter, 10% was romance, 8% was kidlit, which is, I guess, a combination that I used of children's, middle grade, and YA, which is obviously not really a genre, but whatever, that's what I was going for. 5% was historical, 1% was cuisine. And over in the nonfiction, the largest percentage was joint political personal essay collections, in which it wasn't clearly something political, but it also wasn't clearly a memoir. Now beyond that, 15% of what I read was clearly memoir, and 28% was clearly historical and political. Around 3% was travel writing, 3% was sports writing, 3% was finance writing, 6% was arts related, 15% was food related, and 6% was how-to, which in this case was almost entirely organization, cleaning, decluttering type material, because I've spent the past, 2 years, but especially the past year and a half, really being into stuff like that. Finally, the format in which I consumed the books, 50% were ebooks, 48% were physical books, and 2% were audiobooks. Anyway, if you ran your mid-year statistics, I'd love to hear how they went, and if you track categories that are other than what I was tracking, I'd love to hear, oh, you know what I didn't think of looking at, is original year of publication. Because I know I did read a decent number of new releases this year, and the oldest book that I read was about 1,000 years old, but it would be interesting to see what the overall spread was. Next time, I'm gonna have to look at that. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.